Welcome to session 2 of professional development. This week we are going to develop the idea that you brainstormed last week, and we're going to explore this topic to see if it is a viable candidate for creating a professional development session off of. This week we're going to talk a lot about how to do this in a way that doesn't seem overwhelming or stressful, and we'll begin with gathering what we already know about that topic. So, I'm going to give you an example of what a previous session that I've developed looks like, and I want you to do the same. So, on either a blank piece of paper or an empty Word document, I want you to write the name of the idea or title. If you notice on the screen, I'm going to use a vocabulary session I did, and without using any other resources other than what's currently floating around in your brain, so no notes, no Google search, none of that, I want you to write down what you know about that topic already. Okay, so my vocabulary example, when I did this, I knew a little bit about instructional routines. I knew just enough about the rationale behind why someone might want to do vocabulary or introduce vocabulary into their classroom. I knew a lot about word tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 words, and I knew just a little bit about introducing word meanings. But I want you to spend time right now to type out or write or sketch what you already know about the topic. Hopefully you're finding what I did. You find that sometimes in this situation, our brains are prone to what is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is we often overestimate our ability or a depth of knowledge on any given topic. Great example. Over 93% of U.S. drivers view themselves as above average drivers. And we know the definition of above average means not 93%, right? Or you may know that many of us had friends who probably became Facebook doctors or disease specialists during our time in quarantine over COVID. And as we learn something new, we're often highly confident because we know so little. That as soon as we know a tiny bit about a topic, we think we know it all. So oftentimes we overestimate our abilities. So those of us who stop learning here, we have this false sense of mastery. Those of us who continue learning, though, realize that things are much more complex. When we do this, we often lose motivation. And the more we increase our knowledge about a subject, the lower our confidence becomes, which seems counterintuitive. Many stop at this stage thinking that we learned nothing. Only if we keep going can we regain that confidence while getting better. And at the very end, as we collect this information, we will be full of knowledge and almost as confident in our ability as we were when we started. Same thing happened with me. I knew just enough about vocabulary that I thought I could just jump in and do a session on vocabulary. And then as I explored this, my confidence began to take a nosedive until eventually I learned enough that I felt a little bit more confident, close to what I was in the beginning. And as we do research, we want to quickly recognize new ideas and see how they fit into our current schema. So this is not the time this week to go heavy into any of your given subtopics that you sketch out. But this week is a way to test the validity of your idea and to expand your basic understanding. So gathering and combining different ideas is what we're going to do this week in order to expand the depth of our knowledge, and we call this skill synthesizing. One way to think of synthesis is kind of like a puzzle. It requires you to put together different pieces of information from multiple different sources in order to help form a more clear picture. We want to be careful, though, because our audience will be able to tell if we try and force pieces into a spot that doesn't fit. So think about a session that you may have sat through that felt jagged, with maybe information feeling out of place. That's what's happening in these situations. So we know that synthesis is like this PD puzzle. And depending on how we organize our pieces, we're going to tell a story during a session. And what it emphasizes will look a little bit different based on the ideas that we collected. In this gathering phase, the process of synthesis goes beyond just summarizing sources or contrasting, or critiquing sources. We're not just using others' authors' stuff. We're going to pull on these niche different threads in order to make a narrative that makes sense to us. We're making a narrative, a learning that's easy to understand and even easier to follow. So, let's practice. Synthesis requires us to identify the main conversations around the topic we are gathering information about. So, we have to be able to identify major themes, strengths, weaknesses, and gaps that we have in our knowledge base about the thing that we want to explore. And the more resources we look at, the more we begin to notice significant conversations surrounding the topic. And we can ask ourselves, what themes or subtopics appear over and over and over again in the resources that we're looking at? So along the way, we're going to make note of these different ideas because they become categories that help us organize and prioritize the learning that we need to do in order to make our session a reality. Synthesis, it turns out, doesn't require us to organize our thoughts source by source, but rather idea by idea. So we're going to use those common themes that you maybe started with by identifying on your blank sheet in order to see what our common themes will be in our session. So you might think to yourself, what's the local conversation surrounding the topic? You might think the sources we want to include. We might do a little bit of analysis. We might eventually choose to organize information in a meaningful way in order to make our presentation of that information coherent. So, watch me try this a little bit, and I'll show you what I did when I was exploring this idea of vocabulary. I had all of these different sources, and if I was reading them as normal nonfiction books, I would go through with sticky notes, and I would just make notes in the margins of things that I thought were interesting. However, I was trying to read with a purpose. So as I read through these different books, I created categories for the information. And when I came across information that added something to each of those categories, I put that information directly into these categories. You can use note cards for this. You can use Google Documents. Super easy with Google Documents because you can copy and paste information where it needs to be. But as I came across information for each of these categories, I put them in the right place. For instance, when I found rationale for why vocabulary instruction was important from each of these sources, I immediately wrote it down under that category. Or when I saw really cool instructional activities to work on with students in the classroom from each of these sources, I copied and pasted it into that specific category. And I was able to quickly browse lots of different sources for information that would be relevant and timely to the presentation that I was giving at the time. So, an easy way to do this is to use a helpful tool that can help us engage in synthesis, and this is called a research matrix. It helps us organize by idea while also adding on your own analysis based on these different sources. It lets us also quickly, visually, see the strengths and weaknesses in our presentation of ideas. So we don't need every single source to address every single idea we come up with, and there's a high likelihood, honestly, that you're going to have gaps, which is totally all right. When you begin to think of new topics with a synthesizing lens, then every time you have new exposure to information on the topic, it'll give you this idea that you're filling out information into your broadened categories. So sometimes I sit on ideas like this for months before realizing that I've been synthesizing a topic into my schema this entire time. So I'm going to give you an example of mine here with vocabulary. Those were the main ideas on the left that I was exploring, and then those were my notes on the right that came from each source. Honestly, this is just an overview. Mine looks much more lengthy because I ended up with lots of evidence from each of these sources in different areas. So I wrote quotes, ideas, seedlings, things that I thought would be useful or relevant from each of those topics as I was browsing. I was not reading, I was scanning information for things that were viable to the session that I wanted to create. So this shouldn't be an overwhelming thing. It should be an easy process for you to quickly gather and increase your knowledge base on any given topic. If you notice too, I had lots of gaps. There were some resources that were very good for some things and very useless for other main ideas, and that's all right. We can do this with books, or we can do this with websites and other resources as well, and also with conversations from professionals that are interested in that same topic. So, sometimes we need to test the measure of what we think and why we think our idea is valuable. So you're going to notice as you go through that you're going to be left with this collection of organized information and skills on a subject that lets us articulate our topic more clearly, but also gives us this confidence to share our knowledge and skills with clarity. So remember, this week is all about testing and expanding our ideas of what we know about this single topic. You don't have to we're inching closer to the finish line, we're not racing towards the finish line. So one thing to note as we go through this quick reading of different sources is that oftentimes a PD doesn't work because it either has too much theory or too much application. So I'm going to use my vocabulary as an example, my vocabulary session. If I just stood up there and I talked for an hour or 2 hours about why vocabulary is beneficial for students and all the good that comes with it, the people who don't know how to include explicit vocabulary instruction are going to be stuck because they have all this theory but none of the skills. And on the flip side, if I just talked for 2 hours about explicit activities that you can include during instruction to support vocabulary acquisition, then whatever group of stakeholders who don't see the value or worth in including that will never have the motivation to include it into their classrooms. Therefore, it is important that as you browse through different sources, you are looking not only for this idea of collecting theory knowledge, but you're also collecting application knowledge. You want to collect both why something is worthwhile and how to do it. So this brings us to this week's homework. And what I don't want is for this to feel overwhelming. Remember that synthesizing is just simplifying. So our job this week is to, number one, jot down what you already know on your topic. So your main ideas from your head alone, and just start categorizing them into different categories, like I showed in my example. Then, two, I want you to create your own research matrix. It can be digital, it can be paper, and I want you to browse different convenient sources. Remember, we're not reading entire books. We're quickly searching for categories and information to expand our understanding of the topic we want to explore. So we're going to use this in the weeks to come in order to organize our thinking. Here are some helpful tips for when you do this, okay? You want to use main ideas as subheadings to quickly dump all of your information. So you probably already started with 3 or 4. If you can expand that to 5 or 6 different subheadings, anytime you come across information that you think is relevant, you can dump it into those different subheadings. Tip number 2, you want to find information on both theory and application, why it's important, and how can you do it. Tip number 3, you can organize your information later. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to put your categories in order. You don't have to put information in a just right category. Sometimes you might add categories or combine categories or subtract categories, and that's all right. Tip number 4, you have permission to abandon, change, or expand your idea if your research brings you there. If you start doing this and you're like, I just don't think this is the idea that I want based on new understanding, that's okay. You're leaning into that Dunning-Kruger effect. You can tweak it, you can change it, and if you come across an idea that's way more exciting to you, that's inside this idea, go with that one. Next tip, if the information that you find seems exciting, interesting, or useful, you're probably on the right track. You want to write that down because that'll be important and valuable to an interesting session. And the last tip, if a part of an idea seems so overwhelming, you probably have an idea that's too big, or you just haven't learned enough about it. So keep going, keep pushing through. Okay? I'm going to put these directions inside Google Classroom, and we're going to help each other out with our investigating new information along the way. Next session, we will have some of this information gathered, and we're going to be looking through it to see and find what is useful from all the information we gathered. Good luck, and I'm so excited to learn more about the topics that you've decided to chase.